Alright, this will be my second video on Aristotle Onassis, who was just the most fascinating guy of all time. He lived on a private island, he owned the biggest yacht in the world, one of the richest men alive. Obviously, he married Jackie Kennedy after JFK's death, and in part 1, I talked about just how insane and crazy his life was. This video will be more focused on his feud with the Kennedy brothers. It is absolutely wild how much they hated each other, and just to give you an idea of how intense this rivalry was, here's a couple quotes that they said about each other over the years. Aristotle Onassis said about Bobby Kennedy, he said, "He hates my guts, and I'd hate his too if the little Irish shit had any." And another time they got in this big argument on the phone, and Bobby Kennedy threatened Onassis, and Onassis said, "My boy, you don't frighten me. I've been threatened by the experts." And Kennedy yelled at him, "What's in the past is nothing compared to what's in store, you Greek son of a bitch." And there's a whole bunch of other quotes and stories like that I'll talk about. There was so much hatred between Onassis and the Kennedys, and obviously that adds another layer of intrigue to the fact that Onassis married Jackie Kennedy after JFK died. There's also a lot that links Onassis to the murder of Robert Kennedy, so I'll get into all that later in the video, and a lot of what I'll talk about comes from this book Nemesis, Aristotle Onassis, Jackie O, and the Love Triangle that brought down the Kennedys by Peter Evans. And this book is absolutely amazing. It just blew me away. I definitely recommend it. And the story of the book itself is really interesting. So, the author, Peter Evans, was a successful journalist, and all the way back in 1968, Aristotle Onassis hired him to write his biography. And Peter Evans just did a ton of interviews with Onassis and everyone close to him, and then this book got delayed, called off, resumed again, and eventually it came out in 1986. And it's probably regarded as the best biography of Onassis out there. I referenced it a lot in my first video that I did. And after the book came out, Peter Evans gave a copy of the book to Yanis Gorgakis, who worked for Onassis for decades and was one of his closest associates. And this is where things got really interesting because Yanis Gorgakis told Evans that the book was good, you did a fine job, but you missed the one major, massive story when it comes to Onassis. And Peter Evans said, "Well, what is it? What did I miss?" And Gorgakis said, "There's way more to the story of the Onassis-Jackie Kennedy marriage, and you missed a massive story with that." Then Peter Evans talked to other people, including Aristotle Onassis' daughter, and they told him the same thing, that his book was good, but it didn't capture just how much Onassis and the Kennedys just hated each other. And in particular, he was told to look more into Bobby Kennedy having an affair with Jackie Kennedy after JFK's death, and to look into Aristotle Onassis' links to the murder of Robert Kennedy in 1968. Now, obviously, that's some bombshell news. It's actually been talked about in some books and other places about Jackie and Bobby having an affair, but Onassis being involved in the Bobby Kennedy murder was super intriguing. So Peter Evans started talking to the people he knew who were close to Onassis, and he covered all this wild new information about Onassis' hatred of the Kennedys. And so he wrote a second book about Onassis, which focused on his rivalry with the Kennedys and his role in the Robert Kennedy murder. And it's this book here, Nemesis, which was released in 2004. So first up, I'll just talk about how this rivalry between Onassis and the Kennedys began, and then later on I'll talk about Onassis' potential role in Robert Kennedy's murder. And the story of Onassis and the Kennedys begins in 1948. The US had a bunch of big ship tankers that they'd built for World War II, and they no longer needed them, so they decided to sell these tankers, but they made a law that they would only sell them to American citizens. And Aristotle Onassis was not an American citizen, but he formed a U.S. shell company, and he bought 10 of these giant tankers at $1.5 million each, which was a total steal, but it was also illegal. Then a few years later, in 1953, Bobby Kennedy, he was pretty much a nobody at the time. He was just fresh out of law school, and he decided to make a name for himself and hopefully launch his political career by exposing these illegal ship sales. And he started holding press conferences about his investigation and started getting his name and Onassis' name in the newspapers for exposing this fraud. And Onassis was just furious about this because at the time he was negotiating this deal with Saudi Arabia called the Jeddah Agreement. This would have given Onassis exclusive rights to ship all oil produced in Saudi Arabia on his tankers, and had he pulled this deal off, it would have meant tens and probably hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of the deal. And this negative attention that Bobby Kennedy was bringing to Onassis was making the Saudis reluctant to go forward with the deal. And Onassis 100% blamed Bobby Kennedy for this. He has this quote that he said to his longtime business partner. He said, "Nobody gave a shit about who owned those tankers until Kennedy started shooting off his big Irish mouth." Onassis had this other quote that he said to a friend about Kennedy at this time. He said, "This Irish fuck wants to bury me." Onassis also had this bitter rival of his named Stavros Niarchos. Their rivalry was one of the nastiest rivalries of all time, and Onassis also believed that Niarchos was working with the Kennedys because Niarchos wanted nothing more than to sabotage Onassis' Jeddah agreement. It eventually came out that this guy, Bob Mayhew, who was a former CIA agent, and he is absolutely fascinating. That's a story for another time. But Bob Mayhew was hired by Niarchos to plant a bunch of negative stories about Onassis in the U.S. press. So it was Kennedy, Niarchos, and Mayhew all working to sabotage Onassis' reputation and ruin the Jeddah agreement. And that's eventually exactly what happened. All this negative publicity about Onassis led to a boycott of Onassis' ships. He was eventually fined $7 million for his illegal acquisition of the tankers, which is the equivalent of $90 million today. So it was a huge fine. And because of all this negative press, the Saudis got cold feet about going into business with Onassis. They backed out of the Jeddah agreement, and Onassis lost out on billions. And he was convinced that the Kennedys, and Bobby Kennedy in particular, had a vendetta against him. He told a friend at the time, Bobby Kennedy hates my guts, and I'd hate his too if the little Irish shit had any. And Onassis was not a good guy to have as an enemy. He was described as a charming psychopath with no moral imperatives at all, who would just hold a grudge like no other and was obsessed with not just beating, but absolutely destroying anyone who crossed him. His own daughter said about him, when he hated, no one was spared. It destroyed us all in the end. Then, just a short time after this rivalry between Onassis and the Kennedys broke out, things got really interesting at Onassis' 59th birthday party in 1959 because one of the people at the party was Princess Lee Radziwill, who was Jackie Kennedy's sister. She was married to this Polish aristocrat, Prince Stanislaw Radziwill, but they'd only been married for 9 months, and he was basically sick of her already. She was spending up all his money, and he was actually cheating on her with Charlotte Ford, Henry Ford's daughter, and he was ready to ditch Lee and marry Charlotte Ford. And for the sister-in-law of the Kennedys to be at his birthday party, this was like blood in the water for Onassis, because he was also just one of the ultimate womanizers of all time. He liked to brag that there was no woman on earth who could resist him once he got her onto his yacht. And after meeting at this party, Aristotle Onassis and Lee Radziwill began an affair, and her husband was glad about it because he wanted to be done with her anyway. And during this affair, JFK was elected president in 1960, and in the first years of his presidency, Onassis and Jackie Kennedy's sister were seen in public together and on his yacht, and there were articles written about them. There were even articles saying Onassis might become the Kennedys' brother-in-law. And the Kennedys were just freaked out by this relationship, partially because they were just obsessed with their public image, and it looked bad to have the First Lady's sister being seen with a man who'd been fined $7 million by the US government. But the thing that really worried them was that as Jackie's sister, Lee Radziwill would have known a lot of the Kennedy secrets from Jackie. And they were freaked out about what she might be telling Onassis because she knew all about JFK's womanizing and how he'd cheated on Jackie with 1,000,000 women by this point. And according to a lot of accounts, Lee Radziwill herself had slept with JFK while he was married to her sister Jackie, so she definitely had a whole bunch of dirt on the Kennedys. And after this affair had been going on for a while, Bobby Kennedy telephoned Onassis in Paris and told him to stop seeing Jackie's sister. And an Onassis colleague said Onassis basically got a kick out of Bobby Kennedy telling him who he could and couldn't date. They got in this huge shouting match over the phone, and Onassis told Kennedy on the call, "You and Jack fuck your movie queen, and I'll fuck my princess." Now, the movie queen he was referencing was Marilyn Monroe, who was having an affair with both Kennedys, and this affair was mostly unknown at the time. So for Onassis to mention this Marilyn Monroe affair to Bobby Kennedy, this was basically like him flexing on the Kennedys, letting them know that he knew about this affair and could expose it if they didn't back off. Then in early 1963, the Kennedys learned that Jackie was pregnant, and this was viewed as just the perfect PR opportunity for the upcoming 1964 election. It would reinforce Kennedy's image as a family man with the first baby born in the White House in the 20th century. Jackie gave birth to the baby prematurely in August of 1963, and the baby had health issues from being born prematurely and died 24 hours after he was born, and it was said that this just totally devastated Jackie Kennedy. A few weeks later, Lee Radziwill was on Onassis' yacht, and she told him how just completely crushed Jackie was by the baby's death. And Onassis told her to offer Jackie his yacht, which was named the Christina, to go on a vacation to grieve and get away from it all. He said to Lee Radziwill, he said, "Call Jackie now, tell her the Christina is hers for as long as she wants it." Obviously, he probably had an ulterior motive here, but Jackie Kennedy accepted this offer to vacation on Onassis' yacht even though JFK begged her not to go. JFK's secretary said he, quote, looked like thunder when he found out she was planning to vacation on Onassis' yacht because, first off, Onassis was their enemy, but also the 1964 election was right around the corner and they feared it would look just terrible to have the First Lady going on a yacht vacation without JFK. But Jackie was adamant that she was going to go, and it was thought that Jackie accepted this offer partly because JFK had always been so unfaithful to her. He'd cheated on her a million times by this point, and going on this yacht trip was basically payback. One White House insider told Peter Evans Jackie was making the president pay for all his screwing around. And in particular, right before this, JFK had started cheating on Jackie with Mary Meyer, who was divorced from Cord Meyer, who was a CIA chief. And it was said that this affair in particular was what convinced Jackie to go on the cruise because Mary Meyer and Jackie had a lot of the same friends, and they went to the same parties, they saw each other all the time, and this affair was really humiliating for her compared to the other ones. But Bobby Kennedy still tried to get the trip canceled. He called Onassis and asked him to cancel the yacht cruise with Jackie, and Onassis pretty much told him to screw off. And Kennedy flew into a rage and said he would destroy Onassis, and a colleague of Onassis claimed Onassis said, "My boy, you don't frighten me, I've been threatened by the experts." And Kennedy said, "What's in the past is nothing compared to what's in store, you Greek son of a bitch." Then Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was in tight with the Kennedys, he said he asked Kennedy what he was going to do about the yacht trip, and Bobby Kennedy said, "Sink the fucking yacht." But Jackie didn't back off, and she flew to Greece for a 2-week vacation, and on October 4th, 1963, the yacht set sail. There were 9 people on the yacht trip, including Jackie's sister Lee, and there were constant stories in the news about this yacht trip. There was a picture of Onassis and Jackie eating dinner together, and a picture of Jackie in a swimsuit sunbathing on the yacht's deck. And JFK's critics in the government really used this yacht trip as a way to raise controversy and criticize the Kennedys for letting Jackie go on this yacht trip without her husband, but with Onassis, who'd been fined $7 million for defrauding the U.S. government. The yacht trip lasted for 2 weeks, and Onassis basically ditched Jackie's sister Lee on this trip, and he focused all his attention on Jackie, which just infuriated Lee. Her and Jackie had this lifelong sibling rivalry, and Onassis ditching Lee for Jackie on this trip was one of the reasons for that resentment, and this could have also been Jackie's way of paying back Lee for sleeping with JFK, which, as I mentioned, there's a lot that's been written about their affair. Onassis told friends that he and Jackie had sex a few days into the trip, and on the very next day he called Van Cleef and Arpels in Paris and had them fly an $80,000 gold bracelet to his yacht that he gave to Jackie. So Onassis really went all out on this trip, and when Jackie returned to the White House, she would wear this $80,000 bracelet that Onassis had given to her, and it just really pissed off JFK and Bobby even more. And again, this yacht trip happened in October of 1963. Obviously, a month later is when JFK was killed in Dallas. And one of the incredibly odd facts about the JFK assassination is that Aristotle Onassis flew to Washington, D.C. and stayed at the White House immediately after the assassination. He was one of only 2 or 3 non-family members who stayed at the White House after the assassination, and obviously this is very strange considering the rivalry between Onassis and the Kennedys. Now, it was said that Lee Radziwill had asked Onassis to accompany her to the White House, and that's why he was there, because even though Onassis had humiliated her on the yacht trip, she was still hanging out with him because he had ridiculous money. But it was also rumored that Jackie was the one who was behind Onassis' invitation. So regardless of who invited him, Aristotle Onassis did stay at the White House in the days after the JFK assassination. And Onassis and Bobby Kennedy avoided each other for the first day, but the next night they all got drunk, and Bobby Kennedy kept, quote, mercilessly badgering Onassis with questions and trying to get under his skin. Onassis talked to one of his associates on the telephone that night, and he said, "Bobby tried to humiliate me tonight, but I didn't take the bait." And then after the funeral, Onassis would send Jackie gifts and letters, but they didn't meet up in public. It was thought that Jackie was either distraught over her husband's death or just thought it would look bad to move on too soon. But Onassis was also busy at this time battling what was described as the fight of his life. Because his prized possession of everything that he owned, even more than his yacht or his private island, was that he basically owned the city of Monte Carlo. A decade earlier, he bought a bank that controlled 1/3 of the total land in the city, but in the mid-1960s, the government of Monaco tried to take back control of this bank and take over everything that Onassis owned, and this nasty court battle broke out. Onassis was told that the same people who had sabotaged his Jeddah agreement a decade earlier were also behind this battle for Monte Carlo, his rival Stavros Niarchos, Bob Mayhew, and Bobby Kennedy. And there were a ton of smear campaigns in the media and court cases that took up all of Onassis's time, but he eventually lost this battle and he was forced to sell everything he owned and leave Monaco, which he said was his biggest disappointment in life, and this made him almost pathologically angry at the Kennedys and the people he thought were behind this. Meanwhile, Jackie moved to New York City in 1964, and Bobby Kennedy moved to New York shortly after that to start his campaign for New York Senate. There were tons of rumors they'd become romantically involved, that Bobby Kennedy was cheating on his wife with Jackie, and like I mentioned, there's a lot that's been written about this affair between them. Peter Evans talks about it a bunch in Nemesis. Onassis' assistant Johnny Meyer said Ari was pissed when he found out that Bobby had followed Jackie to New York. He said, "Bobby's gonna fuck her, surest thing you know." Roy Cohn, who was a lawyer for Onassis, who's still around today, he said Onassis was a complex man. He could accept the fact that Jackie was sleeping with Bobby Kennedy, but he could not forgive Bobby Kennedy for sleeping with Jackie. I suppose that is very Greek. Then Bobby won the Senate seat in 1964 and he moved back to Washington, D.C., and Onassis started flying to New York to see Jackie a couple times a month. Peter Evans claims Onassis wanted her to marry him, but she was hesitant because she didn't know how to break the news to the Kennedy family, and in particular Bobby. Because the Kennedy family was really banking on Bobby being elected president in the 1968 election, and his strongest political asset was the memory of his brother and by extension Jackie's image as a grieving widow. And if she would have gotten married, that whole image of her as a grieving widow would have been tarnished. So Peter Evans makes it sound like the Kennedys were almost blackmailing her into not getting married again, or at least waiting until after the 1968 election. Then in March of 1968, Bobby Kennedy announced that he was running for president, and this is where the story starts to get really interesting because this guy Mahmoud Hamshari entered the picture. And Mahmoud Hamshari was from Palestine. He was a member of Fatah, which was a division of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And in June of 1967, the Arab states lost a humiliating defeat to Israel in the Six-Day War, and Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula and a bunch of land. And Israel just absolutely crushed them. This war didn't even last a week, and 20,000 Arabs were slaughtered, and Israel only lost 800 soldiers. So the Fatah called a meeting to regroup and figure out what to do after this totally humiliating defeat. Mahmoud Hamshari was at this meeting, and he gave a speech saying that America was just as much to blame for Israel being able to basically do whatever they pleased in the Middle East because America's support of Israel was so strong. And he proposed that they should, quote, kill a high-profile American on American soil as retaliation. The Fatah leadership dismissed this idea. Then Hamshari said that he would help the group by raising a bunch of money through fundraising in the United States. And he was given the green light to do that, so he got a fake passport and he went to Los Angeles to raise money for Palestine's cause. Then in January of 1968, he met with two of Onassis' close associates, and he told them that he had been contacted by a terrorist group who was demanding $350,000 or else they would put a bomb on an Olympic Airlines flight, which at the time Onassis owned Olympic Airlines. It was a Greek airline. This demand was relayed to Onassis, and Onassis called up some powerful people who he knew in the Middle East, and he asked them what was up with this Mahmoud Hamshari guy, was he legit? And he learned something that really intrigued him. It was never really said what it was, but after talking with people about Hamshari, Onassis contacted his associate Johnny Meyer, and he told him, "Get that little fuck back here fast." And so Hamshari and Onassis started meeting supposedly about this terrorist bombing ransom, and they bonded. They had a lot in common. They both experienced tragic wars when they were young. Onassis had his family destroyed by the Greco-Turkish War in the 1920s, and Hamshari had suffered a ton of tragedy because of constant wars in the Middle East. And they started meeting up a lot, and at one of these meetings, Hamshari complained how the LA smog was giving him these terrible headaches, and one of Onassis' associates gave him the name of Dr. William Joseph Bryant, who ran the American Institute of Hypnosis on Sunset Boulevard, and they said he might be able to use hypnosis to help Hamshari with his headaches. Brian was the technical advisor for the Manchurian Candidate movie, and he treated a ton of stars for drug and alcohol abuse through hypnosis. Then in March of 1968, Bobby Kennedy announced he was running for president in the upcoming election, and shortly after that, again in March of 1968, Onassis and Hamshari met again and talked for an entire day and into the early morning, again supposedly about this Olympic Airlines ransom demand. And after this meeting, Onassis gave $200,000 in a bag to his chauffeur, this guy named Roosevelt Zanders, and he told him to deliver it to an address in New York City, and this was supposedly a portion of the hijacking ransom money. Then shortly after this, Onassis went to Los Angeles, and he also met with William Joseph Bryant, the hypnosis expert. On May 17th, 1968, Jackie met up with Onassis for a cruise on his yacht, and she stayed for 6 days and then left, and Onassis stayed on the yacht and continued to sail the world. And that's what he was doing when Johnny Meyer called him on June 5th, 1968, and told him that Bobby Kennedy had been shot and was in critical condition. And Johnny Meyer said Onassis' response was somebody was going to get the bastard sooner rather than later, and then Onassis said, "Call me the minute he dies." And as most probably know, Bobby Kennedy did die from the gunshot wounds that next day, and Sirhan was arrested and charged with the murder. It's almost certain that there was a second or even a third shooter who was never identified or punished, but Sirhan is the one who was arrested and he's still in prison today. Sirhan was from Palestine, so that's obviously interesting considering Onassis was meeting with Hamshari and paying him this airline protection money that eventually totaled over $1 million. And Peter Evans talked to members of Fatah, and they told him when they heard a Palestinian had been arrested for the murder, their first thought was that Mahmoud Hamshari had done it because remember earlier, he's the one who said, "Let's kill a prominent American as punishment for their support of Israel." But the really interesting thing about all this is hypnotism, because that was the really big controversy with Sirhan and still is today. This question of was he hypnotized into shooting Kennedy? Sirhan to this day claims he doesn't remember anything about the shooting. He studied and practiced hypnotism a ton, and he was described as easily hypnotizable. And during the trial, his lawyers demonstrated this by having a hypnotist hypnotize Sirhan in his jail cell and told him he was a monkey, and Sirhan started swinging from the bars of his jail cell and acting like a monkey. He also had these rambling journal entries where he wrote a bunch of phrases over and over again. He repeats RFK must die a bunch of times in the journal. It's really bizarre, like he was hypnotized or in a trance when he wrote this. After the shooting, the LAPD meticulously retraced Sirhan's steps for the past year, who he met with, where he'd been, that sort of thing, but there was a 10-week gap where his whereabouts were described as a white fog, where the LAPD had no idea where he was during this time, and Sirhan himself couldn't remember anything about this time either. Now, these white fog periods lined up with the times Mahmoud Hamshari was visiting LA on his fundraising trips, and remember, he was meeting with William Joseph Bryant during this time, supposedly about the headaches he was getting from the LA smog. And Onassis himself had also met with William Joseph Bryant shortly before the Kennedy assassination. Now, William Joseph Bryant was involved in the CIA's MK Ultra and Project Artichoke programs, and his license was suspended by the state of California for 5 years due to him being caught hypnotizing girls and sexually molesting them. So he wasn't exactly a stand-up guy. And then only 4 months after Bobby Kennedy's death, Onassis married Jackie, so it really happened very quickly, and there are some really interesting things that happened after the wedding that seem to support the idea that Onassis played a role in Bobby Kennedy's death. And the first happened in 1971. By this point, both Onassis' son Alexander and his daughter Christina were dating people who Onassis absolutely despised. He actually thought both the people that his children were dating were being paid to spy on the Onassis family by his rival Stavros Niarchos. And both his kids honestly thought their father was going to harm or maybe even murder the people they were dating. And Onassis' daughter met with her mother, Onassis' ex-wife Tina, and Tina gave her daughter something that she described as really explosive evidence regarding something that their father had done. And Christina told her brother Alexander about this, and they locked whatever this evidence was away in a safety deposit box. And it sounds like whatever this evidence was basically blackmail material that they could use to hold over their father to make sure that he didn't harm the people they were dating. Then on February 18th, 1972, Onassis' private plane crashed and killed his personal pilots, and Onassis believed the plane was sabotaged. His daughter Christina told her ex-husband, "They're trying to have my dad killed," and her ex-husband asked her, "Who are they?" And Christina said, "My father killed someone very important, and this is retaliation." And this plane crash just crushed Alexander Onassis because he basically had this awful childhood. He grew up totally isolated, and two of the only friends he had in life were these personal family pilots. And when they died in this crash, he almost had like a mental breakdown. He told his girlfriend Fiona Thyssen, he said, "I have to break free of my father. It's the only way I'm going to survive. I can't take this grotesque man's domination for much longer." And right after this plane crash, when he was just so distraught over his friend's death, he met with Yanis Gorgakis and told him the explosive information that Christina had told him a month earlier. Alexander said his father financed the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and might have paid to have his rival Stavros Niarchos and Alexander's girlfriend Fiona murdered also. And Gorgakis didn't really take this seriously. He thought Alexander was going crazy, but Alexander showed him the quote unquote explosive material that he'd locked away in the safety deposit box. It was a few pages from Sirhan's diary that had the names Fiona, Niarchos, and Kennedy written on them, then the phrase $100,000, then the phrase they should be killed. So that was Onassis' three most hated rivals in the world: Alexander's girlfriend Fiona, his rival Niarchos, and Bobby Kennedy. And all three of their names were found in Sirhan's diary, along with the phrase they should be killed. And Gorgakis was just blown away by this. He knew that Onassis was ruthless and brutal, but he didn't think he was capable of something like that. But Sirhan's diary having the names of Onassis' three most hated enemies, plus the fact that Onassis had paid $1 million in ransom money to a Palestinian terrorist group shortly before this, and Sirhan himself was obviously Palestinian, it really made him wonder. Plus, there was the fact that both Onassis and Hamshari had met with William Joseph Bryant shortly before the assassination. Then on January 22nd, 1973, Alexander died in a plane crash at only 24 years old. And 30 minutes after his life support system was switched off, Onassis had his assistant Johnny Meyer go to Monte Carlo to, quote, clean up Alexander's apartment. Gorgakis said that this was removing the evidence Alexander claimed that he had that linked his father to Robert Kennedy's death. Then Onassis himself became just gravely ill right after his son died, and one of the last people to visit him on his private island Scorpios was this lady Helene Gaillet, who was invited to visit Scorpios by Onassis just a few weeks before he died. And she spent a week on Scorpios with Onassis, and on her final night there, her and Onassis started talking about religion and confession and atoning for sins, because Onassis knew he was going to die soon. And after they had this long talk, right before she left the island, Onassis told her, "I put up the money for the murder of Bobby Kennedy." Onassis died a few weeks later in March of 1975, and a few years after that, Onassis' assistant Johnny Meyer was working on a biography with Brian Wells, who was former executive editor of the National Enquirer, and Johnny Meyer told him that he had an Onassis, Jackie Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy story that was, quote, worth $1 million minimum and would shock the world. And Brian Wells said, "I knew Johnny was holding back a great story. I mean, a great story." But as they were working on this book, Johnny Meyer died in 1978, and there's basically a 99% chance he was murdered. He died in a quote-unquote bizarre accident where his car got stuck. He got out to push it, but he left the car in reverse, and as he was running after the car, it ran him over and killed him. And whatever secrets he knew died with him. So that's the story of Aristotle Onassis potentially being involved in the murder of Robert Kennedy. There's a lot of information here, but I definitely recommend this book Nemesis by Peter Evans, and a lot of what he talks about really lines up with the Gemstone File, which is one of my favorite mysteries of all time, so the overlap there is very interesting. And I also did a video a long time ago about Eddie Nash potentially being involved in some way with the Robert Kennedy assassination, and Eddie Nash is up there with Onassis as one of the most fascinating people of all time. He was a straight gangster, the biggest drug lord on the West Coast in the 1970s. There's rumors he was involved with the Mossad or some other mafia organization. And Eddie Nash was actually born Adel Nasrallah in Palestine before immigrating to the US. So I was super intrigued by this supposed Palestinian connection that's mentioned in Nemesis, because Eddie Nash had some really interesting links to Sirhan. And I actually hope to redo this Eddie Nash video sometime soon, because this Nemesis book really got me wondering about Eddie Nash and how he ties into all this. And then lastly, thanks as always for the support here on YouTube and on Patreon. I truly appreciate it. It really means a lot. So thanks again. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you soon with another video.